Hi, I'm Jonathan Mayo, your host for the day for Clean Closets Panels on Air. And today we're discussing the topic coming out as trans. And I have a very special guest with me today, Owen. And Owen has done work with the Illinois Safe Schools Alliance as well as the Transformative Justice Law Project. And so thank you for joining us today, Owen.
Thank you for having me, Jonathan.
Yes. And once again, my PGP is he, him, his. And what is your preferred gender pronoun, Owen?
Mine is also he, him, and his.
Great, great. Well, thank you for joining us today. So as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about coming out as trans, and you've done a lot of advocacy work in the trans community, especially here in Chicago, which we're all grateful for. And but I guess first, let me just ask you, is coming out, is that the correct term when coming out as trans?
Yeah, I think it is. I've heard different terms used. Some people use the term coming out, and I know for some trans folks, I mean, I think this is true for everyone, coming out can mean a whole bunch of different things, and it can also happen in stages. I know sometimes people might start expressing their sexual orientation differently and then later come out as trans or not. I don't hear the term coming out as much with young folks. And I know at the Alliance, we're working with trans people who are in kindergarten and coming out or really beginning their transition, which is maybe what I'm hearing more.
Okay.
And yeah, so
Okay.
I think that the language might be changing a little bit.
Yeah, and then terms and things always do.
Right.
I mean, it's even, I mean, I can remember term like now queer, and I mentioned this in our first panel about generations, and queer in my generation was a little bit like uneasy, and now I feel like people embrace that term. So I guess we just have to stay on top of it, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Especially with the youth, and I feel like the youth are forefront for really bringing in new terms and phrases. Now, do you think that people are coming out as trans earlier, like younger, at younger ages now?
I do. I think in some places that's definitely true. Yeah, it seems like when there's an environment or like a supportive community where the parents feel like they can allow their child to be more gender fluid and they're not kind of policing or reacting to kind of gender expansiveness in their young person, that we see both things. Like, a young person might be male assigned, but really like feminine clothing and playing like the princess in dress up or whatever. And that person isn't necessarily going to identify as trans later on in life. But if their family and their school can be supportive of them and be like, oh my God, you look amazing in that pink, onesie. I love it, and just really affirm how that person is expressing their identity. That sometimes that person might later decide in a few years or months, actually, I think I want to start going by a different name, or I don't want people to know that I was ever assigned male at birth. And sometimes not, sometimes, I guess, I don't like the word phase, but sometimes it is just a part of someone's, figuring out their identity, what feels comfortable to them.
Okay.
Yeah, so it is. I think it is happening at younger ages if there's a supportive environment.
Okay. Okay. And you mentioned, some people don't want other people to know that they were assigned a different sex at birth, but then some people proudly identify as trans,
Right.
And why do you think that is?
Well, that's a great question. When I'm doing trainings, usually I make this distinction where some people like trans is, and this is true for me, I feel like trans is my gender identity. Like I don't really identify as male or masculine, even though that's kind of how the world perceives me. But really what feels like home for me is the gender identity of trans. And that feels great to me because it feels like it allows for this fluidity and also honors my experience of 25 years of my life identifying as a woman and being feminized in the world. And that has informed my relationships with my family. And, it's just like part of my experience. And so for me personally, it feels kind of invisibilizing to pretend like that didn't happen or not share that part of myself with people. But there's also moments where that feels very unsafe to, you know, spook my own tea or whatnot. And I think for some people, that's not true, that trans doesn't feel like their identity. They really feel like they are male or female. They are male or female. And you know, being transgender is almost a verb, like it's something that happened in their life, and now they're a man or a woman, just like other men and women. And I think that might just be how people identify, what feels like, you know, home for them and their genders. But also for some people, it's definitely, like I said, it's about safety.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point to bring up, especially, you know, I'm on the associate board for the night ministry, and a lot of their overnight shelters, many of the youth there identify as trans. And I'm sure, I mean, I'm just talking to them all the time. There's moments where maybe that doesn't feel like the safest identity to admit to. I mean, and it's the same for me growing up where I grew up in Kentucky. Admitting that I was a gay person was not always the smartest thing to do. Although for me, I feel like it was not so easy to hide either. But yeah, so I totally understand that. And I feel like you talk a lot about, you mentioned gender being fluid. And I think for us being in this kind of field, we hear that all the time, but there's a lot of people that may be watching that don't really understand what that means. So can you talk a little bit about gender being fluid?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, just some of like the basic language that I'm using, like feeling the feeling or the internal sense of our genders is what I mean when I say gender identity. So like how we think about our gender or understand our own genders inside of ourselves. And I feel like for non-trans or non-gender fluid folks, that might not be something that someone has ever questioned because their gender identity is so consistent with what was expected of them at birth that you've never spent time being like, am I actually a man? Or like, am I not a man or a woman? You know, and usually that's something that only folks who are questioning or have different gender identities than what was expected will do. And so for gender fluid folks, which, you know, the beautiful thing about our community, right, is that there's a lot of different names and identities, and someone might be like, I'm not gender fluid, I'm agender or genderqueer, or, you know, all those different words. But what it really means is, you know, this idea that there are not these stagnant genders in the world. That gender is constantly changing, right? Because what we decide as a society is masculine or feminine is not absolute. It changes over time. You know, if we look at clothing that would be masculine or feminine 100, 200 years ago, it's radically different than clothing now.
Right.
If you like move to different regions, like I'm sure like gender norms in rural Kentucky are different than they are in, you know, the metropolis areas of Kentucky or Chicago, right? They just change depending where we are. And so that fluidity is more like feeling like your gender might be in a spectrum, or the way that you're expressing your gender may be in a spectrum between masculine or feminine, or even kind of stepping outside the idea that there is this line of masculinity and femininity, and that like there's just there's more options than that.
Yeah.
And some people feel very at home in that gender fluidity. It's also really hard, I think, in our society to express yourself in a gender fluid way and really have that recognized, because we have the gender binary so deeply ingrained in our legal system, our education, the workplace. You know, like going to work as a gender fluid person can be really complicated.
Well, even like when you go shopping in the store, and now Target has decided to, you know, erase some of their gender binary labels with like the toy section. And I think that's kind of exciting, especially for someone, you know, I grew up, I loved playing with Barbies, but I also loved playing with micro machines, you know what I'm saying? And Legos. I loved it all. And now that I'm older, I kind of embrace, and I have a friend that I'm sure you know, when I say this, she'll probably know exactly who I'm talking about, but she always says, oh, you're feeling your trans today. And I'm like, I guess I kind of am, you know, because sometimes I'm 32 now, and I just started like putting on mascara like a year ago, and mascara eyeliner, like, because it's like, sometimes I feel like wearing that, but I don't feel like going all like completely on the feminine side, as society would say. So I feel I'm finally embracing that fluidity that I have in myself, and I love it. Yeah. Like, I'm like, I might want to kick up some heels tonight, but I also want to wear like a beard, you know? So I love that. And I feel like androgyny is getting a lot more popular in culture now, but I still feel like androgyny, people don't make that connection that, oh, well, we can still be fluid. And yeah, so it's very interesting. So you talked a little bit about it being in the laws as well. And can you tell us a little bit about the kind of work you've done with law and advocacy?
Yeah. So I went to law school to do trans legal rights work. I didn't really know what that meant at the time. But
it probably meant something a little bit different at the time, I would assume.
It did, yeah. And I started law school in 2004, which is shockingly 11 years ago. Makes me feel really old.
I know, right? And
like, oh my God. How did that happen? But yeah, I thought, you know, maybe I was going to do like discrimination law or something like that. What happened is I went to law school in New York City. I wound up working for a bunch of organizations that I really respected, one of which was kind of my inspiration for going to law school, the Sylvia Rivera Law Project. And works with low-income, trans, and gender non-conforming folks who it's really kind of a merging of poverty law and like critical race law, and thinking about the ways that gender, policing, racism, poverty all combine to really limit someone's options and access to the world, to liberation, and to being able to be who they are. So I got very inspired there, and thinking specifically about the intersections of the criminal legal system with trans folks. And trans identity has been something that's been criminalized in our society since the beginning of like the United States, and was really actively punished for indigenous people from like white colonial folks. And
right, because isn't it true that a lot of indigenous cultures here in the States kind of revere it as like two-spirit, right?
Yes.
And yet we fear it in our culture.
Yeah. And in a lot of non-white, non-Euro cultures, that's actually true, where gender, what we would call gender fluid, although that's like our language trying to explain what's happening, but really the concept of this gender binary didn't exist in a lot of other cultures. And folks like you or I, who are more gender expansive, might have even been considered some of the most wise, holy, kind of like precious members of society, because we have that gift of, you know, being able to blur the lines. And so it's just like a totally different way of thinking about gender in many of these societies, right? And even I think in Hinduism, still some of the gods are, you know, transgender or gender fluid people in that faith. Anyway, so yeah, so we saw, you know, like cross-dressing laws, and even kind of the connection with the sex trade and prostitution, kind of specifically targeting gender non-conforming people. And those laws, for the most part, don't exist anymore. I mean, we still criminalize prostitution, but we don't have cross-dressing laws, at least not in Illinois. But we do still see a disproportionate number of transgender people in the criminal legal system. So when I moved back to Chicago, where I was originally from, I worked with a couple other people to start a legal organization that was really focusing on that issue of how the criminal legal system is impacting trans people, and that's the Transformative Justice Law Project. So we do or have done, you know, direct legal services like criminal defense work, and we also help people with what we would call the collateral consequences of being involved in the criminal system. So, for example, changing your legal name is more complicated or impossible, depending on what you've been convicted of in Illinois. So a collateral consequence of having a criminal case is that you cannot change your name.
See, I never even thought of something like that.
Yeah, so that, and then we see how those kind of systems fit together to really keep people in survival crime, you know, homelessness, poverty, cycles of criminalization. And also really, I mean, for trans folks, not being able to legally change your name, I mean, that's like the law saying you cannot have your identity, actually. That's a very, very profound statement. And so, yeah, so we do that type of work. We have seen the laws really kind of changing quickly, honestly. We've seen a lot of litigation in the prison realm. And we have, a lot, like I said, a lot of trans people who are incarcerated. We don't know the exact numbers because it's not something that most prison systems actually track, how many trans people they have. Most trans...
They don't even recognize it, so right. How could they? Okay.
Exactly. And most people are placed, I mean, jails and prisons are sex segregated facilities. Most people are placed according to the sex that was assigned to them at birth. We have some little statistics here and there, like the National Center for Transgender Equality did a national survey of transgender people, which they just did a second round of. And that survey found that 54% of Black trans people had been incarcerated at some point in their lives. 54%. And that was a survey of people who are not currently incarcerated. So right. We can only imagine the number is much higher. So in the prison context, we see a lot of litigation around where people are being placed, so whether they're in men's or women's facilities. We see a lot of litigation around access to healthcare. The prison system is the only place where we have a constitutional right to healthcare in our country. Where the government has to give us healthcare is when we're incarcerated, which is alarming. Really alarming, but it's true. So we see trans folks, right, we see trans folks who, you know, need certain types of medical care, like hormone treatments, for example, or certain types of mental health and psychological health. You know, surgeries are kind of a whole nother category. But the question becomes, is that legitimate healthcare? Does the prison have to provide that type of healthcare? And so in the past 10 years, 15 years, we've seen a lot of growth and change around that issue, which has been interesting because then we have this argument based on the activism of prisoners, really, many of whom are filing these cases without representation. You know, we have finally some case law that validates trans people as having serious medical needs that the government needs to pay attention to, which I think has changed, for example, healthcare access for people who have Medicaid, or even the Affordable Care Act now says that trans people can't be discriminated against in access to healthcare. I know even for myself, before Obamacare, before the Affordable Care Act, I was denied private health insurance because I was transgender. As a pre-existing condition, or, I mean, it wasn't even that I couldn't get treatment, I couldn't get health insurance because I was trans.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we've seen that change. We have more anti-discrimination protections. In Illinois, we have trans people are protected in the city of Chicago, in Cook County, and in the state for discrimination in housing, employment, access to public facilities, which includes schools. And so we are definitely seeing for young people in schools a lot of changes as far as, you know, does that student have the right to use the bathroom that corresponds with their gender identity? Can they, who's going to know that they're transgender? Can the school like send an email to everyone and all the parents being like, by the way, you know, Timmy is going by Sarah now. Or is that disclosing someone's identity for all of eternity, right? And outing them without their consent. So we don't have clear answers, but we have a lot of cases that are being filed and advocacy work that's being done to try to change the law and clarify what we understand the law to be. So yeah, it's happening. The laws are changing for sure. But we'll say that, you know, the issue of fluidity is really missing from these conversations. Most of the legal changes are really thinking about a very binary idea of what it means to be transgender. We don't have a non-gender, agender option on birth certificates or state IDs or
employee applications.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, and I think, yeah, like you said, that fluidity part is just being left out of it, which, like I said, is something that I only recently grasped in the past years. So, but yeah, and I mean, and I was reading some trivia the other day and I thought, wow, it's even in the animal kingdom, there are species that go back and forth. And I'm like, well, why can't we? I mean, that's obviously part of nature.
Yeah.
We're part of nature. Why is it so hard for us to understand that? You know, not that I'm saying that we're like an oyster, but you know, it's all around us. And like you said, in other cultures, they embrace it. Yet our culture, it's so hard to really find that bridge, and
Absolutely.
really kind of sad, and then leads to those systematic problems that you're talking about.
Yes.
Now, what about, so we've talked about that things are changing in the law, in schools. So what about the image that's portrayed in the media and that we see every day? Do you think maybe that's part of the reason things are changing? Or do you think it's perpetuating stereotypes? Like, we've got Caitlyn Jenner now, we've got Laverne Cox, who plays an inmate in a series and became very popular from that series. So what do you think the media is doing with the image of the trans community?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. One, I think any time, so as trans folks, I feel like we live in a world that paints us as though we don't exist constantly.
Mm-hmm.
It's like every interaction feels like you start with the person on the other side just acknowledging that you exist, right? So whether that's your medical provider or, you know, the financial aid person when you're applying to get financial aid to go to college, it starts there. Like, yes, trans people exist.
Mm-hmm.
And your systems don't understand this, but we do. And yes, my gender marker is female, but I want my name to be this, and blah, 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 blah. And you have to like really get basic with people. And it feels like the problem is in part that we don't talk about trans identity. We don't learn about trans people in school. Medical providers don't ever learn about trans healthcare in medical school. I mean, it really is an erasure. So for me, kind of seeing media, social media, any conversation of trans identity feels like a win, you know, because that means that people at least are aware that trans folks exist. I think Laverne Cox is brilliant, and really, she is constantly, one, you know, kind of calling out transphobic behavior, whether it's, you know, like the Katie Couric, like, you know, you're not going to ask me about my surgery history. That's actually not appropriate.
Completely inappropriate.
I know, to like really forcing people to remember that this is also, we also need to be talking about racism, and we also need to be talking about poverty, and these are all part of talking about trans issues and what trans liberation means.
Mm-hmm.
That, of course, would be the area that I would have a lot of critique around Caitlyn Jenner. I don't feel like she is doing that work, but also, you know, she's a celebrity, and celebrities don't live on the same planet that the rest of us do, you know?
Especially the family that Caitlyn Jenner
right. Yeah.
They're definitely attention hogs.
Right.
Say that.
Right. And so that's also on us as the people who receive the celebrity to be like, oh, your life is not actually what most people experience. But, you know, I think, again, I think it's important that we're talking about it. I feel like her coming out in such a public way has sparked a lot of conversations, a lot of critiques of her, which is great because that, again, means we're talking about it. Our communities are talking about it. So, yeah, I mean, it's also been a year where we've seen an unusual number of trans women, specifically trans women of color, murdered in our country. And so there is this, well, we're talking about it more, but we're seeing the violence increase, or are we just paying more attention to the violence? Has this actually been the way it's been for a while, but no one was talking about it? And I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that it is still a very, very unsafe world for many trans people, specifically trans women, and specifically trans women of color. The kind of the intersection with homophobia and misogyny feels very real with the intersection of racism in our country. So I hope I hope we have those conversations more. And I know that Laverne Cox is compelling us to have those conversations.
Yeah, yeah. And that was actually one of our topics for one of our recent panels was how does race impact the coming out process? Because
Right.
it's like those intersectionalities are intersected, right? So we have to think about that sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I mean, I
So,
really do feel, even when we're thinking about like the school context, there
mm,
is such a different reaction to trans femininity or someone who's assigned male identifying in a feminine way than there is to someone assigned female identifying in a masculine way. Like
see, isn't that interesting?
it's
Yeah.
profound. It's profound.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, it's really about, you know, the fear and hatred of feminine people, femininity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that connects very closely with homophobia, particularly as it pertains to gay men or gay male spectrum people.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and this idea of feminization when there isn't like a woman in the picture or something. Yeah, it's all very, feels very connected to me.
Yeah. And you mentioned that there's a lot of murders in the trans community, especially trans women of color. And I
Yeah.
feel like we're seeing a lot in the news as of late, a lot more suicides as well of transgender people,
Yeah.
which is super, super sad. And so many of those trans people committing suicide are young people.
I know.
Yeah,
I know.
yeah, and I hate it.
It's like it is our job to change the world.
Right,
And
right.
we have to change the world, which is, I feel like I am so over this idea of tolerance, you know, because I'm just like, I don't want to just feel like I'm being tolerated, because I feel like I tolerate a lot of like cis normativity and heteronormativity.
Mm-hmm.
And I should get a prize for doing that. We all should, right? That we've been tolerating it for so long. But I feel like I want to be celebrated, and I want these young people to be celebrated. I want them to be hearing the message of you are amazing and beautiful, and we're so proud of you, and like this is just a wonderful thing that you're doing, and who you are is wonderful. And I want that to be the message that they're hearing all the time from teachers and family and parents and the media, because I think, you know, when you live in a world that tells you you don't exist and that you're wrong and that you're sick and so, you know, all these things, um, it's not shocking that you would have, you know, high suicide rates and,
Mm-hmm.
you know, folks who are in situations that are incredibly unsafe for them. Like, you know, many of the trans women, not all of the trans women, but many trans women who are in the sex trade are some of the folks who are receiving the most violence. That's a
Mm-hmm.
very unsafe situation for many people to be in. And that's very much connected to all these other power dynamics in our world. Um, so yeah, I want that message to be very different than what we've been asking for.
Right. Well, and I think it's hard because I feel that sometimes that message is even perpetuated in that umbrella, that alphabet community, the LGB,
Right.
and then T is sometimes just tagged on. Do you know what I'm saying? But do you think that the rest of the LGB community and the rest of the letters, do you think that they're now accepting trans a little bit more, or how do you think that is?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I feel like it's tricky. I feel like we are communities that should. First of all, we started from places, right? Like if we think about stories like Stonewall or like Compton riots, I mean, a lot of this had to do with gender nonconformity and gender fluidity, and a lot of trans feminine folks were there from the beginning. And really, the policing and criminalization has been targeting gender nonconformity.
Mm.
I think a lot of L, G, and B people who receive homophobia, biphobia, a lot of that has to do sometimes with gender nonconformity, um, being sort of like read or visible as queer or gay or lesbian.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's changing. You know, there's conversations that happen around things like RuPaul's Drag Race, right? And you know, how and when someone who is identifying as a drag performer or as a gay man performing drag when that person can claim identity of trans, how helpful that show is to trans women, how affirming it is. You know, these are some
Right, and then there was the whole debacle with She-Male and right.
Yes. And so, you know, I think those, again, I think the conversations are happening, which is good. I will say that I'll speak from my own experience, and I am like a white trans masculine person who usually is read as a gay man. That's like the thing. People are always like, oh, I knew you were gay. I never knew you were trans. And my gender, the performance has not really changed at all. It just gets read as gay now. But, you know, I find gay male spaces to be very uncomfortable spaces, personally. I feel like there isn't a lot of room for trans identity in those spaces. And it's a space that doesn't assume that trans people are going to be around, similar to the rest of the world. And it's kind of like, but wait, this should be the space where it's, you know, the most present and the most affirming. And I've also felt like there's a lot of kind of unchecked misogyny in moments where I've been in, you know, and these are like, I'm not trying to be general. I think this is just like some experiences that I've had, and it's certainly not true of every space and all that, all those disclaimers. But just, you know, the idea that we can talk about women in certain ways, we can talk about people's bodies in certain ways. I've had my body, you know, touched in ways that didn't feel good for me without consent in some of those spaces, which feels, you know, it's just, they're conversations that we need to be having in every community about, you know, consent and what sex positivity means. And I really look up to specifically the gay male community as being really trailblazers around, you know, kind of creating spaces that are really affirming and in some instances very sex positive, and you know, like the activism around the AIDS epidemic, and just like really how the community was drawing connections between, you know, other marginalized communities that were, you know, experiencing the lack of funding and care and support from the government and everywhere else around that epidemic. I mean, I just have so much admiration. And so it does feel personally in some of those moments where I feel like the space is not very comfortable for me, I feel very disappointed because I'm like, oh no, but I love you so much, you know? Yeah. And so I can't speak for others, but I think there is still a lot of work that we can do to be better allies to each other in the LG.
Yeah, I agree.
So, what do you think about that? I know you're.
I mean, I kind of, I mean, and then coming from the gay man perspective, I think I can see that sometimes as well. And even that, just the misogyny in the room. Because like I said, sometimes there's moments when I want to be a little bit more fluid and just a little more feminine. And even though I don't identify as trans, I can still get some of that flack from other gay men. They're like, oh, you're too sissy. And I'm like, what? Hold on, I'm just being me. Like, what are you talking about? Yeah, so I totally sense that sometimes. But at the same time, like you said, I think a lot of people in the community are trying to build it up and create those affirming, safe zones. And, you know, I've worked with a lot of groups and organizations that do that. And so I feel totally embraced in that. But I think we do need to do a stronger job of bringing that out and now widening that to more communities outside of our own communities. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. I feel like we're in an interesting moment in our movement as a whole right now that, you know, there have been some of these big wins like same-sex marriage, and we have a lot of, not all, but a lot of states have a lot more protections. You know, we can't get fired for coming out, in Illinois at least, as trans or gay or lesbian. But there's still a lot of work to be done. So it's like this question for us of, okay, if we've got these things on paper that are now better, how do we do this internally? Like, how do we clean our own closets?
Exactly. Right.
You know?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and even like you were saying with the intersectionalities of other things, like race, why are we still fighting the race wars? I don't understand. Like, can't we just get over it? Like, people's skin color is different. The end, move on. Like, let's embrace it. Like you were saying, sometimes let's celebrate that, you know? And it's sad that we have to have the Black Lives Matter movement, you know? I mean, why do we have to have that, you know? That's sad. So what do you think, before we head out, what do you think is at the forefront of the transgender movement?
I don't know.
There's just lots. There's just lots, like you were saying earlier. Like,
honestly, I feel like, and maybe this is just where I'm at right now, I feel like we don't have a cohesive movement, actually.
okay.
I feel like when I hear that question, I think of, well, there's this group doing this, there's this group doing this, there's this group doing this thing, there's these people fighting with each other, you know, and I'm kind of like, I don't really know where that's going to go. I feel like I feel like what the next step is for the trans movement in my dreams is that we will have some internal, actual aligned strategy that really has like a critical lens on how these other systemic inequalities are merging with trans issues, and really kind of like advocating for the trans folks in our community who need the most advocacy now, right? That's not Caitlyn Jenner, right? That's like the trans folks who are, you know, living on the streets, or who are dropping out of school, or who are, you know, being hospitalized with suicide ideology. I mean, those are the folks that we need to be saying, what do you need right now? And this movement is going to mobilize around that. And I think what we'll find is that, yes, it would be helpful to have, you know, like my gender marker right on my birth certificate. But actually, that's not the most urgent thing that I need right now. What I need is affirming housing and a place to stay. I need, you know, I need financial support, and thinking about, you know, how and what the role is of our community in supporting people that do not have financial resources due to, like, you know, white supremacy and like all these other real inequalities as far as wealth in our country. And thinking about the role that people who have that type of resource can provide, what their role is in supporting people who don't and haven't had access to those resources. So I guess my hope for the trans movement is that there is a movement, one, and two, that we dig deeper into what inequality actually means in our community.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you for being on the air with us today, Owen. We really appreciate it. I really appreciate everything you've shared with us. And you're right. We have a lot of work to do, but we've come a long way.
We have. Yeah.
We have. And next week, we talk about how marriage equality impacts the coming out process. And that will be the last in our series of panels. It will be on National Coming Out Day. And thank you again for joining us. And don't forget to share your PGP, your preferred gender pronoun, on Twitter. Tag Clean Closet Chicago. You can see it right down here. And then use the hashtag MyPGP. And we'll talk to you later. Thanks, everyone.